Chapter 5.1 The Spirit of Independence. What is a colony? Explore the history of the 13 colonies by learning about their ruler and the frustrations that caused a revolution. Suppose you lived in the time period after the French and Indian War. You may have felt frustrated. Great Britain was passing many laws that some colonists didn't agree with. British soldiers were causing trouble in cities all over the colonies. You might have thought you were alone in protesting against Britain. Then one day in 1763, you read an article in the newspaper. It had no title but number 45. It protested one of King George III's speeches, calling him a despotic minister. It's filled with jokes poking fun at the king. You laugh to yourself as you read it. Who is this writer and who would take on the king himself? That man was John Wilkes. Wilkes was a British writer who protested the British government. He argued that the British government was becoming corrupt and dishonest. Wilkes also wrote a lot about the freedom of speech in the press. He was one of the first leaders to protest the taxes against the colonists. It helped that his writings made some people laugh. Once, someone told him he'd rather vote for the devil over Wilkes. Wilkes responded, "And if your friend, the devil, decides against standing, can I count on your vote?" Wilkes may have been funny, but his words caused trouble. The article, number 45, was especially troublesome. The king was so angry that he ordered Wilkes to be arrested. He was sent to prison in 1768 and was even shot in a duel over it. Wilkes continued to get into trouble all through his life with the British government. Even though Wilkes lived in Britain, the colonists saw Wilkes' trouble with King George as the same as their own problems with taxation and representation. When colonists would protest, they would often chant Wilkes, liberty, and 45. The colonists knew they had to have somebody in Britain's government fighting for their cause. That was important because the colonists felt that Great Britain was not listening to them. They wanted to be represented in the British government, but King George refused. As a result, the colonists began to believe that they were heading towards a revolution. Life after the French and Indian War. Following the French and Indian War, Great Britain was in debt. They owed money from the war. Now, if you're not sure what a debt is when you borrow money from somebody and you have to pay it back. The money that you owe back to that person is the debt. So if you go to Target and you borrow $20 from your older sister so that you can buy a game, when you get home, you still owe your sister the $20. Even though you've got the game, you still have to pay that debt back. She's not just going to let you get away with it. So Britain owed debts to other countries and other people, and they needed a way to raise money to pay this back, and they were trying to take it out on the colonists. So King George wanted to try to pay off the debt. He also had to pay for the troops stationed in the 13 colonies. In other words, he had to come up with money to pay for his army. A colony is a settlement of people who've left their country to settle in another area owned by their home country. So we knew that there were people that were settling here in what we now call the United States. At that time, it was not the United States. It was just a settlement of people that came from Britain and other areas to settle in this area. To bring in new money, King George decided to tax the colonists. A tax is an amount of money that citizens give to the government. Taxes help keep the government working. Great Britain taxed the colony because the 13 colonies depended on British goods. All imports or goods, things that Britain made or produced for us, were coming into the country would be taxed. So just like when you go right now to the store and you spend $10 at McDonald's, you have to pay $10 plus the tax. So it's not just the $10 that something cost, but it's also the tax on top of that. That tax helps other companies and other governments to continue to exist and to be able to run. So it's important that we have taxes. The problem is you have to find the right amount, and Britain was trying to tax and tax and tax and tax. So obviously, as you can imagine, the colonists were not happy. They were angry because they did not have any representation in Parliament, the British government. That meant they had no say in what laws were passed on the colonies. The British could just tax them as much as they wanted without their input. So the 13 colonies declared taxation without representation was not justified. In other words, taxation without representation. They didn't think it was right that Britain could tax without allowing somebody from our colonies to represent themselves in the British government. They believed that representatives from the colonies should also have a voice in Parliament in Britain's government. In 1765, Great Britain passed another tax called the Stamp Act, which required all newspapers and other printed materials to have stamps, which cost money. Anything of paper was taxed. Colonists protested the act by boycotting or refusing to buy British goods. They also wrote letters to Parliament asking them to take away the tax. British merchants were angry with Parliament because now they weren't selling any goods to colonists. The Stamp Act was quickly repealed or taken away because of how well the colonists protested together. So here is a way that the colonists protested peacefully. They just said, fine, if you're going to tax everything written on paper, we're just not going to buy anything written on paper. However, the problems continued. Trouble in Boston. By 1770, Great Britain was still taxing many goods, including tea, sugar, paper, paint, and glass. Frustration was building up in the colonies. A lot of this frustration centered in Boston, Massachusetts. Boston citizens were showing their anger by rioting in mobs and causing violence against the British merchants or officials. To keep peace in Boston, the British passed laws allowing their soldiers to occupy the city. Rather than stop the violence, it made it even worse. Think about this. Some of the colonies were far away from Boston and didn't necessarily see the British soldiers there every day, day after day. They didn't necessarily see all the British ships and all the things taken off the ships that were goods they were selling to the people living in the colonies. So it's kind of like here it is in their face all the time in Boston. So the people in Boston felt like they couldn't get away from Britain. The soldiers were there, all their stuff was coming in. Even though the colonists had things that they could sell, Britain was bringing in their goods. And not only were they expecting us to pay for them, but they were expecting us to pay for them and pay an extra tax. So as you can imagine, the people in Boston were getting a little frustrated. So on March 5th of 1770, the Bostonian colonists formed a mob, that means a group, and protest against the British soldiers. Many of the colonists taunted the soldiers until they were fired upon by the British. In other words, the colonists kept taunting and bothering and chanting that they were not going to take this with taxation without representation. And the British soldiers got to the point where they got so fed up, they just started shooting their guns and they're using their weapons towards the colonists. 5 colonists ended up killed, and many others were wounded. The soldiers who fired their weapons claimed that they did so in an act of defense, but the soldiers were found not guilty when tried in court. Many of the colonists were furious about this. As a result of the Boston Massacre, the British repealed their taxation on imported goods, except on tea. They did not want the colonists to revolt or take up arms, in other words, to fight with weapons against the government. Do you think this worked? Let's see. Great Britain's merchants had full control of all the tea because of the Tea Act passed by Britain. This angered many Bostonians. To show their frustration, Boston merchants and other shipyard workers made a plan that they would hurt the British tea industry. They would try to do it, though, without violence. On midnight of December 16th of 1773, a few dozen Bostonians dressed up as American Indians and quietly boarded the British ships that contained the chests of tea. They grabbed the chest or the boxes of tea and they threw them overboard and into the harbor. So obviously the tea was no longer any good because it was now floating and sinking in the Boston harbor. Around 340 barrels were destroyed during this event, and it became known as the Boston Tea Party. In today's money, they destroyed almost $2 million worth of tea. So it was a huge amount of money back then as well. The mission was a success for the Bostonian colonists. Even so, as a result, Britain passed more laws that would punish the colonists, especially in Boston. So instead of the colonists getting Britain to realize that they were serious about this, they were really tired of not having a representative in government and they wanted some representation. It didn't work. It backfired. And instead, Britain got more upset. The British Army began to send more of their armed forces to the colonies. They locked down Boston so no one could come or leave. In April of 1775, some Bostonian militia, that means military troops, received word that Britain was sending troops to destroy a colonial arsenal. An arsenal is a place where they collect all the weapons and military equipment to store it. So, in other words, Britain was coming in and they were going to try to destroy all the colonists' weapons and armor and uh, ammunition. The Bostonians couldn't let them do this. As the sun was rising on April 19th, they met the British Army at Lexington, Massachusetts. A shot was fired by somebody. They don't even know for sure which person, whether it was that Britain that fired the first shot or the colonists that fired the first shot. But a battle began. The colonists retreated to Concord and fought again. These were started as small battles, but they signaled that the colonists were done protesting. It was time for the revolution. So these were the battles of Concord and Lexington, and these battles were the beginning of the Revolutionary War.